Before your eyes open, you reach. Not consciously, not deliberately. Your hand moves through the dark with the precision of a ritual, across the sheets, past the edge of the mattress, toward the rectangle of glass waiting on the nightstand, like an altar you did not realize you built. And then, light. Blue-white, immediate, surgical, a notification. Then another. Then the silence between them. That peculiar engineered silence your nervous system has been trained to interpret, not as peace, but as suspense. Who was that? What happened? What changed while you were gone? You have been awake for 6 seconds, and already your mind is elsewhere. Not in your room, not in your body, not in the first sacred, unclaimed moments of a brand new conscious day. Elsewhere, inside someone else's urgency, someone else's agenda, someone else's algorithmically perfected architecture of interruption. Before you have formed a single original thought, the world has entered. And here is the strangest part. It feels normal. So normal, in fact, that most people will live and die without ever asking the question that should terrify them. What happens to a human being who never owns their own attention? In the year 55 AD, a man born into slavery understood something about freedom that billions of technologically advanced people still do not. His name was Epictetus. He was not born powerful. He was not born educated. He was not born free. He was born as property, owned by Rome. Owned legally, physically, economically. His body belonged to another man. His schedule belonged to another man. His labor, movement, and pain belonged to another man. And yet, inside this life of external captivity, Epictetus discovered something his owner could not touch, a territory no chain could reach, a domain beyond force. He called it prohairesis, your faculty of choice. Not whether the world interrupts you, it will. Not whether people demand your energy, they will. Not whether chaos exists, it does. But whether you decide what enters the throne room of your mind, whether your attention belongs to you or to whatever shouts the loudest. This was the revelation. Attention is ownership. What you consistently pay attention to WNs you. And for a former slave, this was not a metaphor. It was survival. Now here is where the paradox becomes dangerous. You are likely more physically free than Epictetus ever was. No master, no iron shackles, no legal owner. And yet, how many times today have you checked your phone without deciding to? How many times has your concentration fractured because something buzzed, pinged, flashed, vibrated, suggested, auto-played, or refreshed? How often do you begin one task and end somewhere entirely different? Not because you chose to leave, but because your attention was taken. This is not accidental. Modern attention extraction is one of the most sophisticated psychological operations in human history. And unlike slavery, it does not feel like captivity. It feels like convenience. Behavioral psychologists call one of their primary mechanisms variable reward reinforcement. B.F. Skinner discovered it through experiments with rats. If a reward comes every time, the subject gets bored. But if the reward comes unpredictably, sometimes now, sometimes later, sometimes not at all, the subject becomes obsessed. The uncertainty itself becomes addictive. Pull the lever, refresh the feed, check the notification. Maybe this time something important happened. Maybe this time someone validated you. Maybe this time your life changed. And so, you keep reaching. Not because you are weak, because you are human, and because entire industries worth trillions of dollars have been built around one objective: capturing and reselling fragments of your conscious life. Epictetus had chains. You have infinite scroll. His captivity was visible. Yours is ambient, invisible, portable, socially celebrated. He knew when someone else controlled him. Most people today call it entertainment. But here is the Stoic question, and it cuts deeper now than it did 2,000 years ago. If you cannot consistently direct your own attention, in what meaningful sense are you free? Freedom is not merely the absence of walls. Freedom is the ability to decide what your mind serves. And this is where most people lose themselves, because attention is life, not metaphorically, literally. Your life is whatever you repeatedly notice. What you look at shapes what you think. What you think shapes what you feel. What you feel shapes what you do. What you do shapes who you become. So when your attention is fragmented, your identity fragments with it. You become reactive instead of deliberate, stimulated instead of sovereign. A person living not from intention, but from the interruption. And interruption, repeated for years, becomes a personality. This is the real attention paradox. The more connected we become, the less contact we often have with ourselves. The Stoics had a morning practice. Before politics, before correspondence, before the noise of empire, they protected the threshold, the first movement of consciousness. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, ruler of millions, commander of armies, began his mornings in private philosophical reflection before entering public chaos. Think about that. The most powerful man on earth understood that if he did not claim his own mind first, the empire would claim it for him. And you, before your feet touch the floor, are already scrolling through strangers. This is not a condemnation. It is a diagnosis. Because the first thing you attend to each morning is not trivial. It is architectural. It tells your nervous system, this is what matters. This is what deserves priority. This is who owns the gate. If the first movement of your day belongs to distraction, distraction becomes your default identity. And default identities are rarely chosen. They are inherited. There is a reason silence feels uncomfortable now. A reason empty space often produces anxiety. A reason standing in line, sitting alone, or waiting at a red light increasingly triggers an almost reflexive reach towards stimulation. Because when attention has been chronically outsourced, stillness feels like withdrawal. You are not merely bored. You are confronting the possibility that, without constant input, you may have to encounter your own unedited mind. And for many people, that is terrifying. Pascal once wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He wrote that centuries before smartphones. Imagine what he would say now. Because silence reveals. It reveals grief postponed by distraction, questions buried under productivity, loneliness disguised as busyness, fear numbed by stimulation. This is why attention matters so profoundly. To reclaim your attention is not just to become more productive. It is to recover access to reality, including the parts of reality you may have been avoiding. And this is precisely why so few people do it. Attention sovereignty requires courage, because once the noise stops, you hear yourself. Epictetus taught that freedom begins the moment you distinguish between what is within your control and what is not. You cannot control every demand, every crisis, every message, every platform engineered to seduce your cognition. But you can control whether you grant them immediate access. That pause, that microscopic space between stimulus and response, is where freedom lives. Viktor Frankl would later echo the same truth after surviving horrors that Epictetus would have understood intimately. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is choice. In choice, identity. And in identity, destiny. But space does not appear automatically. It must be protected, cultivated, defended, which means every time you resist reflex, every time you choose depth over distraction, every time you reclaim even one moment from compulsive fragmentation. You are not merely building discipline, you are practicing liberation. Imagine explaining your average morning to Epictetus, a former slave. You wake in safety, in comfort, on a bed softer than emperors once possessed. And before speaking to your own mind, before touching the day itself, you immediately surrender your awareness to corporations, headlines, strangers, marketing systems, social comparison loops, and engineered unpredictability. Not by force, by habit. What would he call that? Not evil, not stupidity, just unconsciousness. And unconsciousness, scaled across years, becomes a life unlived. This is why attention is not a productivity hack. It is an existential question. Because where your attention goes, your existence follows. A distracted life is not merely scattered, it is consumed, piece by piece, ping by ping, until one day you look up and realize you spent decades reacting, not choosing, watching, not noticing, existing, but rarely arriving. Epictetus eventually became one of the most respected teachers in the ancient world. Powerful men traveled enormous distances to hear a man with almost no possessions explain the nature of freedom. And what astonished them was not his intelligence alone, it was his presence. He seemed, by every account, unusually awake, as though his mind belonged entirely to him. That was his revolution. Not wealth, not status, not domination. Attention, undivided, deliberate, free. And perhaps that is what makes his message so unnerving now, because in an age where nearly everything competes for your attention, to govern it may be the rarest form of power left. So let me ask you something. Tomorrow morning, in the fragile seconds before your hand reaches, before the light, before the scroll, before the world tells you what matters, will your first movement belong to you? Or will you hand over another day before your eyes are even open? Epictetus had almost nothing, but he protected the one thing that made him free. You still have that chance. The question is whether you realize what is being taken, and more importantly, whether you intend to take it back.